Good morning. Amen. So we're moving on. Chapter 2 of Max Lucado and Randy Frazier's book called The Story. I invite you to put on your seatbelts because here we go. Because chapter 2 of the story covers more than 20 chapters of the Bible. And a huge story that there are pieces of that in the book, The Story, get completely left out that are important at least to touch on and know are a part of the story before we really get to understand, in a sense, the overall meaning of this section of the story and what God's doing. But overall, in chapter 2, what we begin to discover is that after all the creation, after life begins, after Adam and Eve and Cain, after the story of Noah and the flood, God begins to work within creation to build a nation who will tell the world about who God is. It begins especially with two people named Abram and Sarai. Now, you need to know that at one point in Abram's life, God said to him, I want you to get up from where you are and go to the land that I am showing you. And the next phrase from Scripture says, so Abram went. Now, I don't know about you, but if God comes to me and says, I want you to go to a land that I'm showing you, I have a few questions to ask first. I'd like to know if we're going to Alaska or Hawaii, because how I pack is going to be very different. I'm going to want to know how long it takes. I'm going to want to know what snacks I should take. I'm going to want to know why. What's wrong with where I am? Because at this point in his life, Abram and Sarai had become very successful, very big business people. They had lots of peeps, lots of people under their command. People that they had acquired, because at that time buying people was an okay thing to do. Lots of camels, lots of livestock. They had a lot of stuff. And at this time, Abram was 75 years old, and his wife Sarai was 65. Now, I don't know about you, but in my later retirement years, I'd be happy to stay here. Not go on some big trip that I don't know where I'll go. To do some grand thing. Because you see, God made a promise to Abram. God said, you, Abram, are going to be the father of a great nation. You're going to have a lot of children. See those stars up there that you can't count the number of? That's how many kids you're going to have. And at age 75 for Abram and 65 for Sarai, they had 0 children. 0. They had waited all their life to have kids, but they couldn't. But the cool thing is, Abram said, okay, I trust you, and got up and went, and followed along, taking along his nephew Lot. Abram's brother Haran had died, leaving him control of his son Lot. Lot goes along with them, and all their people, all their livestock, they begin traveling. As they begin traveling, heading from where we would now probably consider modern-day Iraq, heading up into northern territories of what we would call Israel, a famine came over the land. And so Abram takes his whole people down into Egypt, where there was food, and does some interesting things because after being in Egypt, he gets kicked out and heads into the Negev desert. So Abram and his whole group head from way over here, all the way up here, hit the famine, head down here into Egypt. Where in part of chapter 2, what you don't get told is that Abraham decides that once he gets into Egypt, he should lie to the Pharaoh. Because at this time, his wife Sarai was probably about 75 years old, and she was hot. Sarai was a babe. She was gorgeous. And Abram knew that every guy who saw her would want to take her for his wife. Which would mean what about Abram? So they get down into Egypt, into a foreign land, and they know Pharaoh is going to like her. So Abram says to Sarai, "Tell him you're my sister." This would go over really well in most of our marriages, wouldn't it? Right? So Sarai agrees. Pharaoh takes her into his little harem. Diseases and problems start coming over. And then they realize something's wrong here. Pharaoh figures out that Sarai is actually Abram's wife and says, "Get out, and all your people and all your livestock, get away from me," and sends them off into the Negev desert, which is down in the southern area of Israel, of what we call modern-day Israel. Once they get into that area, Abram says to his nephew Lot, "You know what? There are now so many of us, and we have so much livestock that we need to support. We can't all live in one land. So let's split up the land, and we'll each go our way. And Lot, you get to decide who takes what. You get first dibs." So smart Lot decides, right along all these rivers, there happens to be water, which in the desert area brings life. So Lot says, "I'll take that area up toward the Jordan," which left Abram with the desert area up here and the salt water of the Mediterranean Sea. But Abram said, "Okay." So they split up and they move on. Well, the problem is, as Abram was shown by God that this is your land and overlooks the land and moves into it, the biggest problem was there were already people living there. And Abram, this wealthy guy, says, "This is my land." And the people look back and say, "But this is my land." And so battles ensue. And they begin battling with one another. And at one point, Lot gets captured. He's in the town of Sodom. He gets captured by the kings. Abram hears that his nephew has been enslaved and sends over 300 of his best men to save his family member Lot. Gets him, wins, and resets the land between the two of them. God says to Abram, again, "You will be the father of lots of people. Through you, I will build a great nation." And Abram has 0 children. But again, Abram believes God and continues on in his life. Well, finally, the promise is realized. This is where you get into the famous story of Hagar, who is the handmaid of Sarai. Hagar is the gal who does Sarai's hair, who paints her fingernails, who gets her dinner or gets her tea whenever she wants it. And at that time period, when you owned people like that, you could consider whatever children they have as yours. And so Sarai says, "Well, maybe God needs a little help with this plan." And so goes to Abram and says, "Okay, so I've got my handmaid Hagar. Nothing's happening with me. I don't have any children. Why don't you try having children with her, and whatever children she has will be mine, and we'll help God along with this process." So Abram says, "Well, okay, if you insist." So Abram and Hagar get together, and lo and behold, Hagar becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son, an heir. His name is Ishmael. Well, in the midst of it, Sarai and Hagar sort of look at each other, and they don't like each other. In fact, Sarai gets very jealous of Hagar, who now has a child with her husband, and begins to act like she's the wife. So Sarai goes back to Abram and says, "Hey, I'm not liking this anymore. I want out of this deal. What can we do?" And Abram says, "Hey, she's your handmaid. Do whatever you want." So Sarai gets rid of Hagar and Ishmael, sends them out into the desert to die. God encounters Hagar and Ishmael out in the desert and says, "What you doing out here?" She tells him, and God says, "Here's what I want you to do. I want you to go back to Sarai. Things are going to be okay. Go back. So Hagar does. She lives there quite a while with her until Abraham and Sarah get a renewed promise that somehow God will work through them and build a great nation. All of a sudden, some weird visitors come and tell them that they're going to be parents. They're going to have children together. And oh, do they have the deepest laugh they've ever had in their lives. Until at age 90, Sarah gets pregnant and gives birth to their son, Isaac. Now, I've jumped ahead a little bit, and you need to know that in chapter 2 of the story, this entire section gets left out. A very important section of the Bible that you'll find in Genesis. Abraham overlooks Sodom. He hears more about what's going on in Sodom and Gomorrah and understands that God's not really happy about what's going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. And this is the famous bargaining section that you have with Abraham and God. And God informs Abraham that God is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham says, really? What if there's 100 people who are really righteous? Are you going to destroy a whole city for 100 people that could be righteous? And God says, well, whatever. If you can find 100 people, I'll save it. And Abraham says, well, what if I could find 40? And continues bartering down until, what if I could find just one? And God says, look, if you can find one righteous person in all of Sodom and Gomorrah, I'll save it. Well, guess what happened? There ain't one, right? So what happens is Lot and his family are living outside the city walls of Sodom. And one night, a couple of angelic visitors come to them. And Lot welcomes them into their home. And all of a sudden, one evening, all the men of Sodom come out to Lot's house and say, give us those guys that are in your house so that we can have our way with them. Now, chapter 2 of the story skips this story entirely, and I wish they hadn't, because it's really important. And I want you to know, from my perspective, this is a story that has been completely misinterpreted by the church for generations. Completely. And it's an important story for you to know in the midst of all of what's happening here. The scriptures in the Bible say all the men of Sodom came out that night. Hello, all the men of Sodom came out. All the men of Sodom were gay. Now listen, the visitors to Lot's house were men. All the men of Sodom came out and said, send them out to us so that we can have our way. I would use other terms, but I won't adhere. And Lot says, no, you can't have them, but you can have my daughters. And the church has decided that this is the quintessential moment to condemn anybody who's homosexual. Because that's what this story is all about. Because after this story, God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah because of its sin. And folks, it has nothing to do with sexual orientation. At all. Because if all the men of Sodom came out that night, that'd be the weirdest story in all of history. That's not even true in San Francisco. Okay? What the men were really saying, the men of Sodom were saying to Lot, is send us out those guys. Send us out those angels so that we can have power over them. So we can do to them whatever it is we want to do to them. So that we can be in control of their lives. Who do angels represent? Say it louder. God. The sin of Sodom was their need to control God. To do whatever they wanted, with whomever they wanted, whenever they wanted. It wasn't about orientation sexually. It was about power and control. And God said to Sodom and Gomorrah, you are so lost, you are goners. Because you cannot have power and control over me. Enough of a sidestep? Ready to move on? There's more sermon in that, I know. But I want you to know that story's in this section because the storybook skips it. And I wish they didn't. It's an important story in our history. So, after all of that happens, Abraham is about 100. Sarah is 90. She gets pregnant and gives birth to Isaac. And life is good, right? For a while. Until Sarah realizes that Hagar's son Ishmael is the oldest boy. Which means what? He inherits everything of Abraham's. So Sarah goes to Abraham and says, this is not right. God made a promise to you and me, not you and Hagar. I want you to get rid of her. So Abraham sends Hagar and Ishmael out into the desert to die. And God intervenes and says to Hagar, fear not, I've taken care of you. Your son Ishmael will be the father of a great nation also. For those of us in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we draw our lines of inheritance through Isaac. For those in the Muslim tradition, they draw their inheritance through Ishmael. Who was both of their fathers? Interesting, isn't it? So along comes then the story, because we've gotten rid of all of the other folk who have less importance in the midst of this story than Abraham and his son Isaac. And when Isaac was about 15, comes the famous story about how God goes to Abraham and says, take Isaac, the only son that you have now, the one that you love, the one you waited for over 100 years to have, and offer him as a burnt offering. And like when Abraham first heard the call from God, when he was 75, Abraham packed up his son and all that he needed for a sacrifice and headed out into the desert to offer up his son. It's a very difficult piece of the story. Lots that goes on in the midst of it. What happens is Isaac looks up at his dad one day and says, hey, Dad, I know that you told us we're going out for a sacrifice, but, you know, I know you're about 115 now, and so you're sort of forgetful, and you forgot the lamb. And Abraham looks at his son and says, don't worry, God will provide. And off they go up to the top of the hill. Abraham ties him down, begins to move with the knife, and an angel of the Lord comes and stops Abraham and says, now we really know how much you trust God. And suddenly a lamb appears, and they offer the lamb in sacrifice, and Isaac is saved. Now, if I had more time today, I'd talk to you about the faith of Isaac, not the faith of Abraham. Because I think any kid who's willing to lay down and get tied up by his dad and trust God probably has more faith even than Abraham. And I want to take one more side step here. Are you ready? Are you listening? God does not call us to sacrifice our children. You may not take somebody else's child because you think God told you you could. And some people in our world who have sick minds and sick hearts have used this story to justify what they do to our children and to each other. And I am here to tell you as your pastor, thou shalt not do that. That is not, again, what this story is about. Because what this story is about is how Abraham, whose heart was good with God, continued to trust God. Isaac grows up, needs a wife, because God's promise was through Abraham, through Isaac, that there would be a great nation. To have a great nation, you need people. Abraham had how many children? 2, but only one's left. So, what's going to happen? Well, Isaac's got to have some kids, right? So, Abraham says to his servants, you need to go back to my people, because the area in which we're living now is filled with people from all over the world. And I want our people to come from our people. So he sends his servant back to the land that he had come from, and they, lo and behold, meet this gorgeous young gal at the well. Her name is Rebecca. Rebekah takes them back to her house and discovers that they're all somehow related and agrees to go with these strange guys. God bless Rebekah. She goes on a blind date with Isaac and marries him. So she returns. Abraham dies at 175 years old. And in the first 20 years of their marriage, Isaac and Rebekah have 0 children. Until finally she becomes pregnant. And no, they did it right, because she had twins. Their names were Esau and Jacob. Esau was born first, reddish and hairy. Jacob came second, holding on to the heel of Esau as they came out of the womb together. Jacob was smooth and quiet. And Isaac really liked Esau. And Rebekah really liked Jacob. And Esau went out and worked the ground, and Jacob stayed home and learned to be a chef. Esau was the firstborn. Who gets the inheritance? Esau, the firstborn. Until one night, Rebekah and Jacob scheme together, dress him up in some animal skin, and get a blessing from Isaac, who's now really old and can't see. And he gets blessed. Remember in there's that famous story when Esau comes home hungry and says to Jacob, "Hey, I'm really hungry. Give me some food." And Jacob, being the home chef, says, "I'm not giving you anything until you give me the birthright." And Esau is so hungry, he says, "Sure, no problem." Never thinking that would ever happen. And it does. And they split up because you'll remember, if you got cheated out of your birthright, you're not exactly going to be happy with your little brother, right? Jacob goes on with more stories in this whole section of having this dream when he's out in the desert of seeing the angels going up and down between earth and heaven. Remember singing the song, "We are climbing Jacob's ladder"? That's where this comes from. He wakes up and ends up having a wrestling match with an angel. Never lets go, always wins the wrestling match, and says to the angel, "I'm not letting you go until you give me a blessing." What was the blessing? A new name. Jacob becomes Israel, the father of a great nation. And Jacob takes over the story. Jacob falls in love with this beautiful young girl named Rachel. So he goes to Rachel's father and says, "Hey, I want to marry Rachel." And Dad says, "No problem. But it'll take you 7 years of work to earn the right to marry my daughter Rachel." So Jacob says she is worth it. And works 7 years to earn the right to marry Rachel. And it is a blowout wedding. She said yes to the dress. She had the dress of the century. In fact, it was such a blowout wedding that Jacob really didn't know who he was. Well, he didn't really see the bride until the night of the wedding. And when he pulled back the veil, lo and behold, he had married her older sister, Leah. So he goes to her dad and says, What's going on? I'm in love with Rachel. You said I could marry Rachel." And Dad says, "Hey, look, in my territory, the oldest girl has to get married first. You can't marry Rachel until Leah has been married, so I figured you might as well marry Leah. And if you want Rachel, it'll cost you 7 years of work." So Jacob says she's worth it, and works 7 more years until he earns the right to marry Rachel. So he does, and they move on. And eventually, Leah, the older girl that he wasn't in love with, begins to have children. But Rachel, no children. So Rachel says, I've heard about this promise that's come from Abraham, Isaac, and now Jacob. And maybe I need to help the plan along. So she says to Jacob, I've got my handmaid, Bilhah. You really probably ought to have some time with her, and through her children, they'll be mine. And Jacob says, well, if you insist. So Bilhah has some children. And Leah says, well, maybe he'll love me more if I can give him more children, but she wasn't able to bear her own children. So she says to Zilpah, her handmaid, you go check out Jacob and have some children with him, and then maybe he'll love me more because we'll have children with him. So Jacob says, if you insist. And Zilpah has some children with Jacob. Leah finally gives birth to the first and only daughter that Jacob's ever recorded of having. Her name is Dinah. And finally, Rachel gets pregnant and gives birth to the guy we're going to study next week, Joseph, who for a long time is the youngest in the family. Now, how many kids are in the family so far? 12. 1 girl and 11 boys. And you can pick up on that story next week and find out what happened to Joseph, but just a little ilk ahead. When Joseph is in his mid-teenage years, Rachel gets pregnant again and gives birth to a baby named Benjamin, who becomes the youngest, and she dies within hours of giving birth to Benjamin. And then next week we pick up on the story of their children. Well, what you need to understand is what's on the sheet that you also got here. Why are we spending so much time talking about all of this? Because I don't know about you, but I am not a subscriber to Ancestry.com. It doesn't matter to me, but it does today. Today's a really big day for genealogy. Because way back here, God made a promise to Abraham that he and Sarah would be the parents of a great nation. They would have more children than the stars they could even hope to count. And 25 years later or so, they finally had a child together named Isaac, who married a woman named Rebekah. And 20 years after they were married, they finally had a child together named Jacob, who then fell in love with Rachel, who years and years later finally had a child with him named Joseph. What you begin to discover in all of this family history, which is better than any modern day TV show you could ever hope to watch, is that when God makes a promise, God keeps it. And though you and I do not know when that time will come for that promise to be fulfilled, God keeps that promise. And though you and I don't know exactly how that promise will be fulfilled, God keeps that promise. And when you and I think that God has forgotten about the promise or changed God's mind about it and decide that we're going to help God fulfill that promise, God says, that's not what I planned. I'm still true to my promise, and makes it happen. You see, what all of those folk had to do was learn how to trust God. And through all the difficulty they faced, through all the painful years that they went through, they began to know that they could trust God and God's promises. And that's not an easy thing for you and I to do in an age that gives us answers through the computer like that. Where you can drive through and tell your order to a little booth here, and by the time you drive around the corner of the building, have all the food that you just ordered. How weird is that? Right? You and I love to get what we want when we want to get it. Hello, housing crisis. Right? This is a part of why our nation got in so much trouble over these last several years. Lots of us decided we wanted the big dream house. And we can have it, and we can have it now, before we worked hard enough to get it. And so we bought into mortgages that we knew we couldn't afford. Because the world told us, you can have what you want, and you can have it now. And God is teaching us, it may not be all that you want, but the promises that I have been making from the beginning of time, I will keep. Trust me. And we human beings keep showing God that we don't. You see, it would be nice to think that age 90, Sarah was still a super hot chick. And she had the body of a 25-year-old Pilates instructor. And no wonder she got pregnant. But she was 90. She was well beyond the years that women could have children. She was 90. And the story is not about her. It's not about how strong she was. It's not about how weak she might have been. It's about how strong God is. And the amazing things that God can do in our lives when we least expect it, and through those whom we least expect. You and I need to learn what those people learned. That where we see futility, God sees fertility. Where you and I look at the problems of life, God sees opportunities. The only way you and I are going to see those opportunities is by trusting in God. Now, I don't know about you, but a long time ago, God promised me that God would send Jesus back and make things right. And it's been over 2,000 years. And as far as I can tell, things aren't right. There are still people misusing and abusing even the scriptural stories. There are people misusing and abusing each other. We have country leaders who are calling people to use chemical weapons on their own people. We have people in our own nation who are food challenged. Things on earth are not fully as they are in heaven. And I do not know what's taken God so long to bring Jesus back and make it right. But I figured, perhaps if Sarah could learn to laugh at 90, because at 90 she had finally learned to trust that God will provide, that you and I, in whatever stage of life we have, can learn to trust God too. I don't know when everything's coming right together, but I do know who's going to do that. And until then, I'm going to do my part by trusting God and learning to live the way God wants me to live. And I'm going to learn to trust that when God makes a promise, God keeps it. May it be so for all of us. Let's pray together. Gracious and holy God, we don't understand your ways or your timing. But we have been told for a long time that you've made some promises. And along the way, we've seen some of those promises come true, but we're waiting for the really big one. For it to be on earth as it is in heaven. Help us, like all these ancestors before us, to learn to trust in you. To know that when you make a promise, you keep it. So for however long that takes, and in whatever it is we face in our lives, may we as Christians who have seen a promise fulfilled in the death, the resurrection, and the ascension of Jesus, that you are fulfilling your promises. And you will send him back. And life will be right and heavenly. So thank you for all these people before us today. They're a part of our story. May we see ourselves a part of that story too. For we come to you in the name of Jesus, who taught us to pray together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Our time of